Hello and welcome to Automotive EV Live. My name is Peter Wooding and thank you for joining us. This afternoon, I'm with Torben Wyludda, and we're going to be looking at, simplifying it, how to move waste from one country to another, and what's that got to do with lithium-ion battery. Torben will give us all of those answers that we're looking for, I'm sure. And so without further ado, I will look forward to handing over to Torben. Torben, the now virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for having me. I hope to be able to answer all those questions. Well, as Peter said, today we will be talking about transboundary waste transports. And now you may be asking yourself, what's that even got to do with me? And the answer to that is quite simple: a lot. Everything. Because at some point in its life cycle, everything becomes waste. And that, of course, includes lithium-ion batteries, even if they have a second life in energy storage outside a car, as outlined in the other talk earlier today. Let's see. Today, we will have a quick look at the legal framework for said waste transports. We will define waste and see what processes are applicable for their transboundary transport. We will check how to categorize lithium-ion batteries as per the applicable waste legislation. We'll have a look at a little case study. And finally, I've got some recommendations for you and your waste transports. So you will have the basics covered there as well. There it is. First things first, the legal framework. So to give you perspective, in the late 80s, the international community realized that waste was a problem because rich countries kept shipping their waste to poor countries where it would pollute the environment and endanger the people there. And of course, the rich countries were happy to be rid of the waste, but the poor countries suffered. And to put a stop to this practice in particular and reduce waste transport in general to a minimum, the Basel Convention was thought up to set some rules in that regard, how to transport waste from one country to another. Today, we have 187 nations and organizations that are parties to the treaty. The United States and 8 other countries that are, with all due respect, less significant on the world stage, are not parties to the treaty, but everyone else is. Since the Basel Convention is not directly law in the party states, though, we have to go down a level or maybe some levels. For example, we have the OECD, of which a lot of countries, I think it's about 37, are members at the moment. And the OECD basically introduced some sort of Basel Plus. They outlined some rules which are the Basel Convention plus some additional clarifications. And since, of course, the United States are a member of the OECD, they still pretty much adhere to the same rules as everyone else. Then, if you, for example, look at a European country, you have to consider European law, which consists of the Basel Convention, the OECD rules, and a little extra. And then we go down to the national level, which in case of an EU country would be Basel Convention plus OECD rules plus the EU law plus a little extra. And that little extra is what makes it really extra challenging, because every country can make additional stricter rules when it comes to waste transport, which means just because you know the waste law in Denmark, that does not necessarily mean you know the waste law in Belgium. And since the strictest law that concerns the transport is always applicable, we always have to check in all involved countries. Now, we will be a bit more specific. What even is waste? And first idea, of course, is to think of the stuff that you throw away in the kitchen. But fortunately for us, waste is very clearly defined in the Basel Convention. And you have the quote right there: substances or objects which are disposed of or are intended to be disposed of or are required to be disposed of by the provisions of national law. And basically everything that needs to be disposed of. And now you may be thinking, but I'm going to be recycling and not disposing. But it is further defined that means recycling operations. So that's where they get you. Now that we know what waste is, it is important to know that different transport procedures apply for different kinds of waste. For simplicity's sake, we will say there are two kinds of waste, and we will call them, for simplicity's sake, hazardous and non-hazardous waste. This, by the way, has nothing to do with dangerous goods. Something can be non-dangerous goods but hazardous waste, and conversely can be dangerous goods and non-hazardous waste, which is exactly what we will get to here in a minute. The transport processes for these two types are very different from one another. Hazardous waste requires a so-called notification. And what you do is you tell your environmental authority what kind of waste you want to move from where to where for what purpose. You submit the permits of all involved carriers, if applicable, because not all countries require carriers to have permits for waste transport. You give them the exact route, and that goes down to which exit of the motorway the truck has to take when it's delivering a container, let's say. And if there's a traffic jam on the motorway, the driver cannot just exit and get on to accesses later, because then he's deviating from the route, and that would make it an illegal waste transport. You will have to provide a deposit, because in case something goes wrong and the authorities have to organize a return or the disposal of your cargo, they don't want to chase the money after the fact. So deposit or nothing will go. And of course, in the end, you need the consent from all involved authorities. That is to say, the authorities of country of origin, country of destination, and all transit countries. You see, there's quite a few of authorities involved, so the process may take a while, typically 3 to 6 months. But 3 months is really optimistic and only achievable, I would say, if everyone knows exactly what they're doing and they've done it for the exact same type of cargo on the exact same route before. Otherwise, 6 months is probably more realistic. If you have non-hazardous waste, that is a lot simpler. In most cases, all you need is an accompanying document with information about the cargo. It basically just says where it's coming from, where it's going, and who the carriers are, and of course, what it is and what's supposed to happen with the cargo. Now, lithium-ion batteries. They are kind of a special case because they are dangerous goods, as we all know, but they are probably non-hazardous waste. And the main reason for that would be they are pretty new. As I said earlier, the Basel Convention was come up with in the late 80s, and lithium-ion batteries were not really a thing back then. So if, for example, we have a look at the waste codes A1170 and B1090 of the Basel Convention, A being the one for hazardous waste and B being the one for non-hazardous waste, we will see that it should be B1090. We have batteries that are conforming to a specification, excluding those made with lead, cadmium, or mercury. So from that perspective, lithium-ion batteries would be non-hazardous waste. And I included another example that is from the EU list of wastes, 160605, other batteries and accumulators. There are codes in EU law for batteries with cadmium, with mercury, with lead, and they're all hazardous waste. But lithium-ion batteries are not expressly mentioned and fall under the other batteries category. This, of course, does not automatically mean that it will forever be this way and that it is like this everywhere. Laws are constantly evolving and each country can make its own rules. So before you start to transport, you have to check if there are additional extra rules in that particular country that maybe make your batteries hazardous waste. For example, a couple of years back in Germany, there was the intention to make lithium-ion batteries hazardous waste, but that mysteriously disappeared from the revised law just before it came into effect. But you can see the idea is there. We'll now look at a situation where defective lithium-ion batteries have to be transported from Vietnam to Belgium for recycling. What are the steps that need to be taken waste-wise? Of course, the classification of batteries in terms of dangerous goods is very important. Are they defective? Are they critical? And of course, some other things have to be taken into consideration as well, but we will focus on the waste part here. Firstly, you have to classify the batteries. As we've just seen, we would lean to a classification of non-hazardous waste from the information that we had in this case. Of course, we as a logistics provider are not the experts on the battery itself. That can only be the person that manufactures the batteries. But still, we would lean to saying that is non-hazardous waste. To make sure we abide by the law, we had to check with the authorities if they agreed with our idea on how to move these batteries, or perhaps there's a special national law that makes a notification necessary. Perhaps there's a special law that makes these batteries hazardous waste. In this case, that was not the case, which was quite fortunate for us. The next step was identifying suitable carriers. Carriers, of course, need to have the permits to transport waste in their respective countries. Ocean carriers need to ensure that they accept the cargo on their vessels, in this case from Vietnam to Belgium. In case there's no direct connection from Vietnam to Belgium, for example, transshipment via Singapore, there might be a case where the terminal in Singapore that this carrier is calling does not accept this type of cargo. Then, of course, the carrier would not be able to provide this service. This is something, obviously, that has to be cleared up in advance. And in the end, the accompanying document, the information document that I mentioned earlier, had to be created. And because we have a transport to the EU in this case, we also need a disposal contract, you could call it, a contract between shipper and consignee that stipulates who is going to pay if something goes wrong along the way. This is a standard contract prepared by the EU. You can download it from the internet. It's something like 2 pages long, tops. And after all this had been done from a waste perspective, the transport could start. So again, we were very fortunate that the batteries were classified as non-hazardous waste here, and no laws contradicted this. Now, as a little help or maybe inspiration for you, I have compiled some tips for compliance and avoidance of fines. Other than impose fines, of course, authorities can also decide to ban you from exporting or importing waste in the future. And that would, of course, hamper your business operations long term. Pardon me. So, the first thing is always categorize your batteries. Know why you decided to classify them under a certain waste code, so that you can answer questions that other involved parties, i.e. The authorities mostly, will ask you in that context. Secondly, have a plan. That sounds really simple, but you have to determine what process is necessary for the shipping of these batteries, and then I suggest you define an SOP for these transports so everything will go smoothly. Thirdly, contact the authorities. They are friends and helpers in this case, and not an antagonist that you have to trick. I cannot stress this enough, because they will tell you if perhaps a special national law applies and a notification is still necessary. Maybe batteries are categorized as hazardous waste. Maybe they have further tips for things you haven't thought of. And this, of course, does take time, but delaying the transport is probably better than paying a hefty fine or having the cargo stopped and returned to the shipper by the authorities. And to top it off, being all over the news for doing an illegal waste transport. The headline would then be something like, "Your company organized illegal waste transport." And that, of course, will stick with people who won't think of a clean and perfectly fine battery. They will think of a smelly pile of rubbish that is being transported illegally. And lastly, select your service providers carefully. We, of course, being a service provider that works with other carriers, with our network there, we have to do that as well. And so I can only encourage you to do the same. Tell your service providers the cargo is waste right from the beginning. Emphasize this, because people will quote for absolutely everything, and when it comes to the booking, they will say, "I'm sorry, but we don't accept waste." Of course, have them send you their permits for waste transport if these exist in the involved countries. This is it from me for today. I mean, of course, there are always finer intricacies and details in each individual transport, but I hope you will be able to take something useful away from this and perhaps avoid some common rookie mistakes when starting with your waste transports.
Firstly, thank you very much. I thought that was very clear. It was concise. It was informative, and actually covered a lot of the points that I'm sure were on people's minds. And actually, from the number of questions I personally have had before, you've actually answered quite a few. There was one from Kim Lee. How do you assess a damaged battery pack? Or is this the responsibility of the forwarder? Is there an amount or type of damage that means it would not qualify to transport?
Not from a waste perspective. Of course, the assessment of the battery pack cannot be done by the forwarder. The shipper has to tell the forwarder what they classify the battery pack as in terms of being defective or critical or whatever, and how they came to that conclusion. And of course, they have to discuss this with the forwarder and find a common basis that they both agree on. And if they both agree, for example, okay, this battery pack is defective but not critical because of reasons 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, certain tests that have been made, that is something you can go ahead with and that a forwarder can work with.
Thank you. Do you have any idea about what the consequences are should a shipper offend the international waste transport regulations?
If you get caught, well, that's always the question, right? Chances are pretty high that you will not get caught. I have to say that. But it's becoming increasingly likely that you will be, because authorities, customs personnel they become increasingly aware of waste shipments. And if you are indeed caught, there will be fines, of course, depending on the country you're caught in. That will depend on national law. And as I said earlier, there is always the chance that the authorities will ban you from importing or exporting waste. So if you have a container with waste lithium-ion batteries in the port and it is stopped by the customs and they realize, oh, it's the third time we have such a container and the third time there is no waste documentation at all for the same consignee, they may say, okay, this consignee is not allowed to import waste anymore. Which, of course, if it is a recycling facility or something like that, that would be the basis of their whole business that would be gone there. But typically, recycling facilities know what to do. But yeah, other than fines, you could be banned from or exporting waste.
Thank you. Who is normally the recipient when you ship a container with the end-of-life lithium-ion batteries?
Typically, it's recycling facilities. We've had this talk earlier about second life for the batteries, that you could use them as a storage for energy outside the car. And if you say want to use the battery as energy storage in Europe, and you have the battery in Southeast Asia, for example, or America or wherever, and you ship it to Europe to be used as energy storage, that won't necessarily be a waste transport, because in that case the battery will still be used as a battery. But yeah, typically the batteries that we transport go to recycling facilities.
Okay, so generally, are they always the recyclers that will receive them?
I would say in most cases, yes. There are cases where OEMs want to receive battery packs back from abroad for further testing or evaluation. In which case, we also have a special situation where it's not necessarily waste, but that always depends on that particular case. But yeah, in most cases, it's recycling facilities.
Perfect. Thank you, Torben. One question. A number of people obviously would like to see the slides, but we can always check with you, and then when we go with the production of this as a catch-up, we could talk about whether or not you would allow the people to download the slides if they want. Realistically, well covered, thank you. We're really exactly on time for a keynote presentation. Really appreciate you doing it. And I'm sure our viewers are. And like I say, you covered most of the questions, to be fair, within your presentation. Otherwise, there were duplications. There was one other one quickly coming in. Are there any specific limitations per transport mode to ship waste? From Elia.
In terms of quantity, no.
But by transportation mode? I think they're meaning air or rail.
Oh, well, in theory, no. In practice, you will have a very hard time to go by air, and depending on the road, you will have trouble going by rail. For example, from China to Germany by rail, which is a big deal, you will have problems getting waste on there. But for example, within Europe, as long as the tracks are the same width, that is not an issue.
Perfect. On behalf of us, thank you very much, Torben, and I'm sure on behalf of the viewers, really interesting, really informative, and really appreciate you doing it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Keep safe. Thank you. Bye. Bye.